Okay, welcome to this UK REACH webinar. So today we'll look at the extension of the registration deadlines, some of the implications thereof, and also the risks, related risks, uncertainties, but also some of the risk management measures that we can come to think of. So today it's a bit of a special webinar from our REACH Law side because we have Simon Tilling from Steptoe joining this webinar. So happy to have him here. Before Simon gets to introduce himself, I'll just introduce myself first. So Fredrik Johansson is the name. I'm a partner, head of sales at REACH Law. Been working with REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations, including the UK REACH regulation for as long as these regulations have existed, more or less. So more or less 20-year background in EHS and chemical regulatory consulting. So Simon, please, if you could introduce yourself to the folks and the public, please.
Great, thank you, Fredrik, and thank you, REACH Law, for having me along, and thank you, everyone, for participating. My name's Simon Tilling. I'm a lawyer. I'm a partner at the firm Steptoe and Johnson, and I've been practicing environmental and chemicals regulatory law for nearly 20 years. And a lot of my practice, of course, I live in England. For many years, my practice was EU law, because chemicals law, of course, was set by the EU. But I'm an English qualified lawyer, and so with the new independent UK regime, I've been paying particular attention and focus on the emerging UK regime, which, of course, we're talking about today. Thank you, Fredrik.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so some practical information, housekeeping rules, if you will, for the webinar. So this is an interactive webinar, so you can use the chat function to submit questions during this webinar. We'll answer those questions as far as possible during the Q&A session. We'll also answer your questions that you've been submitting in advance when you registered to this webinar. And for those questions that we will not be able to answer during this webinar, we'll come back to you by email. And as you may know already from past webinars, so we will record this webinar. It will be made available on our YouTube channel called REACH Law Talks. So in any case, of course, please feel free to give us feedback. We appreciate that very much. And of course, that helps us become better over time. So the agenda is fairly packed today as usual. So we'll start with just a brief introduction to REACH Law, and then Simon will just briefly introduce Steptoe. Then we'll go to the UK REACH. We'll look at it in brief and where we are now, just as a recap. Then we'll look at the consultation on the extension of the registration deadlines, and after that, Simon will talk about the process, the legislative process, if you will, for updating the UK REACH regulation to accommodate for changes into the deadlines and so forth. And then closer to the end of the webinar, we'll look at the how to manage this uncertainty when it comes to the potential postponement of these deadlines and the change in the registration process, which we'll cover. And before then concluding and then having our Q&A session at the end. So we'll aim to have this done in 60 minutes, but for those of you who are familiar with REACH Law webinars, you know that they probably go a bit over time, so please feel free to leave and come back and look at the recording on YouTube, or then, of course, if you want to stay, then we're very happy with that, of course. So we start with a brief introduction to REACH Law, and then Steptoe. Well, let's start with REACH Law for those of you who don't know us yet. So we provide support for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So this today obviously also means UK REACH, but then of course the mother of all chemical regulations, the EU REACH regulation, and also the Turkish REACH, the so-called KKDIK regulation, which is in a very active phase at the moment because the registration deadline is end of next year, which, by the way, will not be postponed. We learned last week. Then we also provide support for Korea REACH, albeit through our local partner there, and when India REACH hopefully enters into force at some point, then we'll also provide support services for that. And the reason is because we have, except for South Korea, we have locations in all of these jurisdictions where these applicable or these chemical regulations are enforced or will become enforced. So for UK Reach, our Manchester office is relevant. But today I'm speaking to you from the head office here in Finland. So just won't go into the details, but just to say that we do provide a full set of services when it comes to UK Reach. So if you need an only representative, that is what we can do and provide such services through our UK entity. And of course, all related regulatory dossier preparations and submissions, such as late doing notification, inquiry, co-registration, lead registration, the works, and also the more demanding work, such as authorizations and so forth. So we've actually submitted already lead dossiers for UK Reach and also authorization dossiers. So we're quite deep into UK Reach, if you will, but also all other consulting and support and training services where need be. And as mentioned, we have our YouTube channel where also this webinar will be posted in due time, usually within a week or so. So it's called Reach Law Talks. Please head over to YouTube, and if you find our contents of interest, please feel free to subscribe and even like the videos. We appreciate that very much. So Simon, I'll just hand over the floor to you and just let me know when to change slides.
Great, thank you, Frederick. So I joined Steptoe about a year ago, and one of the compelling reasons for doing that was their breadth of the international practice. So on the next slide, there's a very useful map, the point of which to demonstrate Steptoe is a US headquartered, Washington DC focused regulatory firm. What it's really known for are complex regulatory advice and challenges and dealing with governmental authorities and regulators, which of course is precisely what we do with EU Reach and chemicals regimes, and what we are doing with the new UK regimes as well. So it has offices in the major regulatory capitals, Washington DC and Brussels, and of course London has grown to be and is growing to be a regulatory capital too. So I actually work from the Brussels office on the EU side of the practice, my EU law work, and UK law work from the London office. But we've got lawyers doing chemicals and life sciences work in all of those red dots, all of those areas. On the next slide, where you can read this at your leisure, I won't go through everything, but particularly, we're very well known for regulatory law, but particularly chemicals regulation is a particular specialism of Steptoe. So great accolades and awards that we've won as a global team for our chemicals regulations. And on the European side, the next slide just has a few mugshots of people you may have come across and recognise. I'm far from alone. It's great to have 10 lawyers and scientists working on the European side. So and we very much brand it as Europe, EU in Brussels and UK in London, but it's still one integrated team to provide you with that seamless service. That's everything I'd like to say on Steptoe. Thank you, Frederick.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so just to conserve a bit of bandwidth, we just turn off our cameras at this point before heading over to the disclaimer and copyright. So as you already maybe seen this previously, but basically it just says that any actions you may take based on this presentation is of course your own responsibility and risk. And I invite you to have a more detailed look into the legal text if you like. So we'll not go into the details here. So I'm not the lawyer in this presentation today. Okay, so let's start with UK Reach in brief and look at the status today. So I think most of you already know this. So UK Reach already entered into force on the 1st of January 2021. I said, well, technically it was one hour before that UK time, but let's call it just 1st of January 2021. And it means that it is essentially defined as EU Reach as it was at that time, plus a number of statutory instruments updating and providing UK-specific changes and tweaks to the legal text. So to change, for example, EU into UK and so forth. And a bunch of implementing regulations such as on data sharing and so forth. And it's usually during these webinars, we've always said that there is still no consolidated legal text available, but I'm happy to say that actually there now is a UK REACH consolidated text available at legislation.gov.uk. So you can actually go there and and read it in a way which is much easier than just jumping between different legal text in different statutory instruments, and of course the EU original text as updated. So the main requirements of UK REACH according to the current, just want to emphasize the current legal text, especially when it comes to the registration part, is that to register substances that are manufactured in or imported into Great Britain at 1 ton or more. And of course, it means substances that are not specifically exempt from the registration requirement or exempt from the whole UK REACH regulation. So the same no data, no market applies in the UK for UK REACH also. Or should I clarify that in Great Britain? So it does not apply in Northern Ireland, because that is still the domain of EU REACH. So there are, according to the current legal text, there are several registration deadlines depending on the hazard properties of the substance and the tonnage band, starting in October 27th next year, and then for the higher tonnage bands and the more nastier substances. And then for 100 to 1,000 tons, it's in October 27th, 25, and then October 27th, 2027 for the last registration deadline, according to the current text. Beyond that, there's also an authorization requirement to apply for authorization of uses that are included in Annex 14 for substances. So it's the authorization list that I think most of us knows from the EU REACH regulation. Then we have also restrictions in Annex 17 carried over to UK REACH, the same essentially as EU REACH. Then there are requirements for safe use of substances, so substances and mixtures that have an SDS provided, then you need to, of course, use those substances according to the guidelines of these safety data sheets. Or if a safety data sheet is not provided, then according to other guidance of safe use, and of course, according to authorization conditions where applicable. And also there are different provisions for communicating information in the supply chain, for example, on substances of very high concern in articles and so forth. So you can see that the basics are essentially the same as under EU REACH. There are some important consequences of UK REACH on the legal roles, if you will, of certain type of actors. So before UK REACH entered into force, GB manufacturers will continue to be GB-based manufacturers under UK REACH. The same applies for importers sourcing substances from outside of the EU or the European Economic Area or Northern Ireland. They will also continue still to be GB-based importers under UK REACH. But the biggest change comes actually under the downstream users, who essentially were downstream users or distributors under EU REACH in the UK. Now that there's a UK REACH in place and the UK has left the EU, they suddenly have become GB-based importers also under UK REACH. In this category, the latest category where these downstream users become importers, distributors become importers, we have these transitional arrangements in place. We'll talk about this briefly also. So an important concept under UK REACH is the so-called existing supply concept. It means that these transitional measures, including the downstream user import notification, this doing, which we'll see on the screen, apply to substances that were in active trade into the UK during 2019 or 20 at any volumes. So it means that if you did not supply or import as a downstream user, for example, or you used to be a downstream user, but now you're an importer according to UK REACH in Great Britain, and you didn't import this substance 2019 or 2020, then you would not be seen as being under existing supply, and you could not submit, for example, a downstream user import notification, but you would have to go and register first before you are placing the substance on the GB market at 1 ton or more. I'll come back to that in just a second. So basically, this applies to importers, but also only representatives under UK REACH. And only these could downstream user notify substances under this existing supply, and they can still do it under a so-called late due notification scheme, if you will. So the most important part is that to understand that these substances, if they were actively imported into Great Britain, and they were, for example, covered by an EU-only representative, but they were sourced from, for example, the US, but still covered by an EU REACH-only representative, a UK-only representative can be appointed in these cases to perform a downstream user import notification to cover the import obligations of these same recipients. So these companies who used to be downstream users now suddenly became importers, but then there is possibility to appoint an OR by the non-GB manufacturer formulator, and thus these would again become so-called downstream users from a UK REACH perspective. And what is important to understand that this existing supply definition, if you will, applies to the GB importer on the GB importer level. So this importer would have to have been under this existing supply to be able to be covered by an only representative. So it means that actually they would not necessarily have had to have received the substance from this company who has appointed the only representative, but they most certainly would have to have had this active trade for the same substance. It can have come from a different supplier. So the most important thing is, if you are now suddenly become a GB importer, make sure that you have some records showing that you were importing in 2019 or 2020 from anywhere this particular substance at any volume, because then you are seen as being under existing supply and you can take benefit from these transitional measures, meaning the downstream user import notification and these later registration deadlines that we will be talking about today. So that was a long story, but hope you understood. In all other cases where existing supply does not apply, you first have to inquire and then register substances before placing them on the GB market at 1 ton or more annually. So this is the same requirement as if there wouldn't have been any Brexit. So in practice, this means that you have to inquire and then submit a so-called new registration of an existing substance. You may have seen this NRES mentioned somewhere. So it means that you are registering a substance that has been registered under EU REACH, but you are registering now again under UK REACH because you cannot benefit from these existing supply provisions. So the registration requirements, coming back, looking at them just on the basics thereof, so they're the same as under EU REACH. So all manufacturer imported substances such as part of mixtures at 1 ton or more must be UK REACH registered. The tonnage band requirements, data requirements related to those tonnage bands are the same. The registration types are the same. You either register as a normal or a full substance, meaning it's not an intermediate. This is the most typical, I would say, form of registration. But in some cases, you can, if you're located in Great Britain, you can register certain substances that are consumed during on-site from one sort of a substance to another, and this is a very complicated topic, so we'll not go into the details. You can register it as an on-site isolated intermediate, or then if you receive it from elsewhere, for example, even outside of the UK, certain substances which are consumed and transferred into another substance, again, a very complicated topic, will not go into details, can be registered with lesser data requirements, provided they are under strictly controlled conditions during the whole supply chain and the life cycle of that substance. This joint submission concept, one substance, one registration, applies. You need to have a lead registrant, co-registrant. We'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next slides. Data and cost sharing provisions apply, so the same fair, transparent, non-discriminatory provisions apply, albeit inside of Great Britain, and of course the requirement to keep information up to date. So just briefly, as mentioned, the joint submission concept applies. So it means that you have a lead registrant who submits the bulk of the information pertaining to that substance, such as Physchem, tox, ecotox information as applicable, and the chemical safety report in some cases on behalf of all other companies registering the same substance. All these other companies are seen as co-registrants, sometimes called member registrants. Well, we just call it co-registrants. And all of these together form a joint submission. And once it has been, once the lead dossier has been submitted to the UK HSE, so the Health and Safety Executive, by the applicable registration deadlines, which are the topic of this webinar. So just quickly, the registration fees, always stirring up emotions. I think the inquiry does not apply any, or no fees apply to inquiry, but then the registration fees for large enterprise sizes are shown on the screen. So they're equivalent to those of EU REACH. So if you would be registering for EU REACH, you would paying more or less the same registration fees to the HSE. And just to note that if you are a company who have grandfathered your registration, so meaning you already held a registration in Great Britain before UK REACH entered into force, you were able to grandfather those into the UK REACH system. So in those cases, you would not have to pay these registration fees to the HSE, because essentially you're seen as already being registered, albeit you need to take part in the joint submission effort. Already mentioned the HSE, but they are the authority in this in UK REACH, so they're like ECHA for UK REACH, and the IT system used for submitting most dossiers, not the authorization dossiers quite yet, but all the other dossiers, essentially like registration, DUI notifications, and so forth, is to comply with UK REACH, and it's available at the shown URL. So it's like REACH IT more or less. And just to give you a quick comparison chart between the EU REACH and the UK REACH, because this was actually one of the questions we received, so I just wanted to have a slide on it. So it just shows that what are the differences and similarities. So essentially, we can say that it is very similar, except that in the UK REACH, it's not called pre-registration. There is no pre-registration concept as such in the UK REACH regulation. There is a downstream user import notification concept, but that's a bit different. And it only applies to GB-based importers and only representatives for EU REACH registered substances. So it's not comparable in that sense. But the inquiry applies the same process. Registration, the same process applies, albeit this is now under discussion about extending the deadlines. And then the data requirements, there are talks about having an alternative model for submitting registrations for substances of lesser concern. We'll touch upon that in the coming slides also. Grandfathering is a concept unknown to EU REACH, but applicable for UK REACH due to these transitional considerations, if you will. Polymers, the same requirements, albeit under UK REACH, EU REACH, there's a REACH review going on, which may see some polymers needing a registration, but that's some years down the line. Other than that, essentially the requirements are the same. So we'll not go into details. I invite you to pause the pause the video on YouTube, for example, if you want to go into more details here. Okay, then looking at the consultation on the extending of the UK REACH registration deadlines, this is something that the UK government was looking into, extending these transitional registration deadlines, and the reason was and is to ensure that they have enough time to actually then go ahead and develop this new registration model, which we'll discuss, and of course have time then to integrate these changes into the legal text, and thus there is a need to extend these deadlines because they're coming up, as you saw in one of the first slides. The first registration deadline is already coming up next year, according to the current legal text of the UK REACH regulation. So there was actually a public consultation to be held, or it was already held. The reason was to get feedback for the government to help them decide on how to move forward with this extension of the registration deadlines. And now we'll look into that consultation in a bit more detail. So the consultation on extending the UK REACH submission deadlines, so the registration deadlines, ran from July 5th to 1st of September. So for example, REACH Law took part of this in this consultation. So it was open to anyone, private persons, stakeholders, companies, anyone, anywhere actually could participate in this consultation. So they really sought feedback on these government proposals, two proposals thereof. The first one was to extend the current UK REACH deadlines for these transitional registrations, so these registrations that were under existing supply. We discussed this earlier. Well, three options were provided. We'll look at that in the next slide. And also due to the proposing to extend the deadlines, there were also the need to extend the dates whereby the HSC would carry out compliance check of 20 dossiers, 20% of the registration dossiers submitted, because of course they could not do a compliance check before the substances would be registered, because there would be no data. So these go hand in hand. And currently we are in a situation where the DEFRA is analyzing the responses received, and they will come back and publish the results of this consultation on the Gov.uk website. And it says no later than 12 weeks following the end of the consultation. So what this means in practice is that we are looking from some sort of a feedback decision from the government by December this year. So it essentially can come at any time, but I think this is a very complicated topic, so I think it will go closer to this deadline. And one of the questions was that, is the results of the consultation already available? So the answer is no, not yet. We're expecting it closer to December. So I mentioned the three options for extending the registration deadlines. So essentially we had the first option being that there would be no change. So the current deadlines would still apply. But then that would be option 0. But the first option, option 1, was that the current deadlines would be increased with 3 years. So it means that the October 27th, 2023 deadline would be postponed to 26. The next deadline would be postponed also with 3 years. It means that the option 1 deadline for the lesser tonnage band substances, so 100 to 1,000 tons, for example, would happen in October 28. And then for the smallest tonnage band, it would be in October 2030. So that would already go into the next decennium, so to speak. Option 2 would be that the first deadline would be postponed with 3 years to 26, the second with just 2 years to 27, and the last deadline just with 1 year to 28. So this would keep these in this decennium. So that would be that is also the preferred option by the government. So they've been advocating, I would say, for this option 2. But the industry no surprise there, is of course advocating for this option 1, whereby the latter registration deadlines will be postponed into 28 and 30. So these, I think, depending on the consultation, I'm not a betting man, but I think like maybe option 1, option 2 will happen. You can remind me if I'm wrong on that. That would be my bet if I would be a betting man, so to speak. Okay, so those were the options. We'll see how the consultation goes and the outcome thereof. So we're all very excited to learn the results by December this year. But the idea, also underlying idea here is that the postponement of the registration deadlines gives possibility for the government to come up with this alternative new registration model. So this was already alluded to already by end of last year by the Secretary of State for the Environment, that said that DEFRA has committed to exploring alternative arrangements for UK transitional registrations in order to support chemical business whilst upholding the highest standards to safeguard public health and the environment. So this is something that has been brewing and is a result of work undertaken by the HSE, the different agencies, DEFRA, and also trade association, industry, and so forth. And they're looking into investigating this potential options to reduce the burden and the cost for registrants. So meaning reduce the requirements to include data, costly data in these dossiers. And this is something that is still ongoing, and information is very scarce, to say the least, on this. Excuse me. So what the new registration model means compared to the old one. So if we look at the slides now, we can see the current process. I will not go into the details here, except just to show on the screen, if I get my laser pointer working, is that we have these different type of registrations that all essentially feed into the same substance group, in which you need to select the lead registrant and then prepare the lead dossier with the full data requirements according to the current requirements of the UK REACH legal text. So this is the same as the EU legal text. So it would mean the full set of Fyschem tox and cotox data and so forth. And then you need to have the lead registrant submit their dossier before the co-registrants can join the joint submission, and do this depending on your tonnage band and type of substance by the applicable registration deadlines that are now under discussion. So if there is no new registration model, then this is what will happen. So the same type of an joint registration effort as you see for EU REACH and for Turkey REACH for that matter. However, the new registration model, and I just like to note that this is very speculative at this point and subject to a lot of changes, I suppose, is that we have the same setup. You're still grandfathering substance, you're still inquiring, you are still submitting your NRES registration, but all of these feed again into a substance group where you need to select the lead registrant, but then depending on your substance type, is it a so-called substance of high concern for the UK, and this definition is to be determined, then that would still require the full set of requirements as we just looked upon, meaning the same requirements that are in the current legal text and the same requirements that are in EU REACH, whilst if it would be of so-called lesser concern for the UK, then you would only need to prepare a so-called hazard profile based on publicly available data, and then a registrant-specific risk assessment. And this is, I'd say, more or less what we know at this point in time. But to our understanding, this also means that the lead registrant would prepare these dossiers, albeit the registrant-specific risk assessment would probably require more input from each registrant. But as said, this is to be determined. And despite my efforts trying to to get more information from the authorities. They are very tight-lipped on this. So the new UK REACH registration model is still in development, and it will still take some time before it is ready. I would not hold my breath on this. So the most important thing at this point in time is the extension of the registration deadlines to give the government enough time to actually prepare the new UK REACH registration model. And with that, I will hand over the floor to Simon. So Simon, just let me know when to change slides. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Frederick. So let's go on to the next slide, please. The law, as Frederick has made very clear, the law as it currently stands on the UK statute books has the deadlines of October 2023 being the first one. It's very clear that it is the intention of the Department for the Environment to give industry more time to develop this alternative transitional registration approach, as Frederick has been describing to you. But to be clear, this isn't entirely a decision simply for ministers at the Department for the Environment. It of course, requires the agreement of the lawmakers, that's UK Parliament here, to change what UK REACH says. So there is, of course, a process that needs to be navigated. It's not simply up to the ministers at the Department for the Environment, DEFRA, to make that decision. So what I wanted to talk through with the next few minutes is just how that legal process works, to give you an idea of the fact there is a process to be followed, the fact that Parliament will exercise its legislative powers to control that process, and just so we can build that into our expectations of what will happen over the next few months as we head into 2023 and that first statutory deadline as it currently stands. Now, life has been made easier by Parliament for these changes to be made, and I'll just explain why. The default position in UK law is that if you want to change something as important and fundamental as the REACH regulation, you'd need a new Act of Parliament. You'd need to go through the full parliamentary scrutiny to change the law, because it's as an EU regulation, it has the same status, if you like, as a full Act of Parliament needing full parliamentary scrutiny. And that's also true for CLP and biocides and plant protection products and all those other EU regulations. It is possible for Parliament to say, we actually trust ministers to put forward secondary legislation, which are known as statutory instruments or regulations, to make limited changes. But where Parliament gives ministers these powers, they are very limited. So just to give you a really good example of how that works, when we moved across to UK REACH in the first place, as one of Frederick's earlier slides had, there were lots of statutory instruments changing the text so that we take out the European Chemicals Agency and you'd put in the Health and Safety Executive, for example. All of those changes were done by this secondary legislation. But as you can see from the slides, actually, Parliament only ever gives ministers very constrained powers to do that. So those powers have already expired. They could only have been used to correct these deficiencies in REACH to give us UK REACH as it was in 2021. But ministers can't use those powers now to continue to tweak UK REACH. But as I explain on the next slide, Parliament and the ministers have realised that reform of REACH, UK REACH, is actually something that's very important and very much part of this government's agenda. So in something which was known as the Environment Act 2021, which was a really big piece of UK legislation, but we're only worried about Schedule 21 here and Section 140, so a very small part of a very big act. It gave the powers from Parliament to the ministers, to the Secretary of State, to amend REACH, and only REACH, So this isn't CLP or biocides or the other big pieces of UK chemicals regulation from the EU, but the government knew it needed to change REACH, or it wanted to change REACH. So Parliament gave government these pretty wide powers, and the quotes on the slide, to ensure a smooth transition to a UK chemicals regime. So it's partly to help with this transition which we're talking about, but also so that in the future, ministers can keep that legislation, REACH, up to date and respond to emerging needs or ambitions. So this has been deliberately put in to UK law so that REACH, UK REACH from here on in, can be amended through a quicker process. Yes, it will be used to change these transition dates. That is, if DEFRA wants to change these dates, this is the legislation it will use. But this will also be used, or could be used, and it's the intention of the government to use it, to change quite a lot of other aspects of UK REACH too. So it's really worth bearing in mind that that this exists, and what it does, you don't need the detail, but what it does in principle is it gives the power to keep UK REACH moving. Now, whether that's to keep pace with EU REACH and the REACH revisions we're seeing in the EU, or whether it goes in a different direction, is then really up to the ministers. This power isn't unlimited, though. There are some safeguards that Parliament has put in place to make sure the ministers don't go too far, and I think they're also worth noting. First of all, every time the ministers want to change the law, they have to explain how the changes they want to make are consistent with the purpose of REACH, which is a high level of protection of human health and the environment. So the ministers have to explain to Parliament how the changes they want to make are still consistent with that aim. There are certain provisions called protective provisions which you cannot change. I'll look at those in a moment. And it's also because UK reaches across the whole of Great Britain, England, Scotland and Wales, but the Minister for the Environment is really just for England. Or the Secretary of State for the Environment, any changes that want to be made also have to have the consent of Scotland and ministers in Scotland and Wales. So there are constraints to what you can do. The next slide, I just quickly highlight the protected provisions. So these provisions, ministers cannot change. They have to go back to Parliament and have a new Act of Parliament if these provisions warrant changing. But things like Article 10, which is the data requirements to go into a dossier, that is not protected. That's entirely within the remit of the Secretary of State to propose legislative changes to give effect to that. And there's lots more parts of REACH that aren't protected provisions that can be changed through this easy tool. If we go to the next slide. So let's just look at that in practice. There's still a process. Even this easier mechanism still requires a process. First of all, the ministers must consult. Well, that has happened, as Frederick has already said. They must take into account the outcome of those responses. So it cannot pre-decide its preferred option and not listen to the responses. It must methodically work through those answers, which is why it's allowed itself up to 12 weeks to make sure it does that properly. After that, so we're talking early 2023, if DEFRA wants to amend the dates or make any other changes, it has to lay before Parliament a draft of the statutory instrument it wants to pass. That won't happen until Parliament returns from the holiday season break in early January. And then both houses of Parliament must actually vote to affirm that they agree with that change. So there's still a parliamentary process. Now, all Parliament can do here is approve it or annul it. They can either say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't, and the whole thing goes back to the drawing board. They cannot change it. So there's no long legislative process, and there have been very few statutory instruments that have ever been annulled by Parliament. Most of thousands of these that do go through, most go through, but it does require a positive affirmament, a decision by both houses of the Parliament to pass the law. Then it goes back to the Secretary of State to sign, which is what we call made. and then it comes into force. Now there's some question marks and some TBCs down at this end of the process, because of course that all depends not just on what ministers want, but also on what Parliament wants, and when parliamentary time allows. Parliament has lots of business to deal with, and sometimes these things can get delayed. So we'd expect it, as we've discussed, to have gone through this legislative process by the spring of 2023, but it is not entirely in the hands, it's certainly not in the hands of industry, it's not even in the hands of DEFRA, the Department for the Environment. There is a process to go through. So of course, we need to watch this very carefully and see what happens. I have also put a note that while you cannot challenge acts of Parliament in the courts, somebody who was disgruntled with the changes to UK REACH could challenge those in the courts, which could further hold things up. Unlikely again, but a possibility. So I flag it there simply to illustrate that we cannot be certain in October 2022 that this will all get passed in good time. Which will bring us on to our what can you do about that. But before I do, I just want to have a quick word about on the next slide, the what's been known as the or referred to as this Brexit Freedoms Bill. Its correct title is the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill. But just so you're aware of it, in parallel to all this work on reforming UK REACH and making it work for the transition, there is a bill currently before Parliament, only just a couple of weeks into Parliament. And what this bill will do is it will repeal and revoke all EU legislation, including REACH and CLP and biocides, all the other chemicals regulation, but all the other EU regulation, unless between now and the end of 2023, Parliament approves that it stays on the statute book. So here's a process where every piece of EU law that we currently have copied and pasted from the EU. There will be a process where ministers say we want to keep this, and then Parliament has to affirm that it wants to keep it too. And it's just worth noting that when this bill was first suggested before Parliament in a parliamentary debate, Lord Frost, who introduced the concept of it, said there were many difficult issues that were faced in the UK, and many of them were over regulatory issues generated by the European Union. And Lord Frost went on to pick out 3 or 4, and REACH was one of those that he expressly mentioned in that parliamentary debate. Now, that does not mean, and I want to be very clear, that does not mean that my expectation is that we're going to get rid of UK REACH. I suspect the more likely outcome is that Parliament will affirm that we need a version of UK REACH, and then with the powers I told you about on the previous slide, the UK REACH may well be modified. It will be modified. It will be changed. First of all, it will be changed to have these later transition deadlines. But we cannot rule out, as at October 2022, that this political process, which I'm talking about now, this revocation and reform bill, could mean that certain chemicals regulations, and it could be the REACH regulation, are revoked altogether, and the UK starts with something new. So it is a period of uncertainty, and while that's not my expectation, it would be wrong not to mention that it could have a quite significant impact. So that's back to you, Frederick, for what we can do about this uncertainty.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so I think I'll probably note at this point already that we will go over the 1 hour threshold, so please bear with us. So just to note on how to manage this uncertainty and the risks arising from this legislative process. So of course, the uncertainty, as Simon mentioned, it continues until we have this legal certainty on this new transitional registration deadlines. So this is of course the most urgent issue to get clarity on, because it essentially triggers the requirements at this point. For example, if there are delays, then companies need to start doing something ahead of the registration deadline according to the current legal text, which is 27th of October next year already. The legal certainty when it comes to the new registration model, that's actually not so urgent. Of course, it would be good to obtain, because then industry would also know and understand what would be the data requirements and start preparing accordingly. At this time, we do not know, so everyone is more or less in a holding pattern, if you will, in a wait and see status. And this uncertainty, of course, may then hamper investment decisions into developing, let's say, activities which manufacture chemicals and or import chemicals and stuff like that, because you do not know what is ahead of you. You know the worst case, which we will look at in the next slide more or less, and you know the best case, which is that well, I will not call the best case no UK REACH regulation, albeit theoretically, as Simon said, that is possible. But the best, we say, reasonable case is that you get a new registration model requiring less data for these substances of so-called lesser concern. And of course, these risks from the delays also feed into this supply chain uncertainty, because then as we are seeing, for example, in Turkey at the moment, and I can draw some analogies to UK REACH, is that if there are uncertainties, it will show up in the supply chain in the form of who is actually then going to cover, for example, the registration of a substance in the long run. The longer the uncertainty goes on, the less companies are then taking action to say that, okay, I will cover this substance in the supply chain for UK REACH registration. And this is especially true when it comes to UK REACH only representative cases, so where ORs, only representatives, are involved in the supply chain. So there are situations where the upstream manufacturers are reluctant to take the lead on this, to say that, okay, I will register. This means that then if you have in the supply chain formulators beneath them who would be relying on the registration of this supplier through their only representative, but if they're not taking those steps to ensure compliance, then the formulator has to consider, okay, then I have to maybe take care of the registration effort because my supplier is not doing that, and I need to appoint an OR. But then there are issues with confidentiality. Maybe the upstream manufacturer or formulator does not want to disclose the substance ID, the composition of a mixture, for example, to the companies who want to then take care of the registration efforts and stuff like that. So all this uncertainty just feeds into this sort of situation where essentially nothing happens. And I would argue that it is a bit detrimental to the business, the chemical business per se, at least in the long run, if it persists. No one likes uncertainty, I think. So the worst case scenario, if we look at risks, I would say would be that there is a delay in the legislative process for whatever reason, albeit it is unlikely, as Simon mentioned, is that the legislative process goes beyond the first registration deadline according to the current legal text, which is the 27th of October next year. So just in a month, or one year or so. And this applies for the high tonnage banned substances, CMR substances, and so forth. So these companies who would then be in this situation that they're placing these substances on the GB market would then have to suddenly scramble to prepare a full lead dossier, and of course all the other members of the same substance group who want to register the substance would then have to become co-registrants and register by this deadline, provided they are, for example, over the 1,000 ton threshold, or providing CMR substances 1 ton per year. So they would suddenly have to do everything by this 27th October next year, 2023 deadline, just to stay compliant. And this, of course, would have I would say, quite huge implications, both in terms of the need for registration expertise, but also, and more importantly, on the data access. So everyone would, or not everyone, but many companies would suddenly need a lot of data, and I think that would probably, unfortunately, drive up the price to a certain level. So surely this could not happen, is a question mark, I would say. So better to be prepared, I would say, for this sort of a scenario. So some recommendations on how to manage this uncertainty. So well, I'll take the first one and then hand over to Simon to look at the other ones. So for our recommendation, and Simon mentioned that we should have the legislative update process done in the spring. So that is cutting it fairly close, because our recommendation is, and having many years of experience when with preparing lead dossiers and negotiating access to data, if any doubt by March next year that there will not, or there may be some issues with getting the legislative changes hammered through and done by the first registration deadline, our recommendation is to start preparing for a joint registration, meaning start preparing the lead dossier and more specifically inquire as soon as possible, because this means that you will be placed in the substance group and you will be able to take the whole registration process forward, and you will see who else is going to register the same substance. Then, of course, in that substance group, you would need to select the lead registrant as soon as possible. Then, of course, look at what data you have, what you need, what are the data gaps, where can I get this data at what costs. And of course, then prepare the lead dossier and issue letter of accesses to all the other co-registrants who need to meet this deadline. And do this, of course, in a good time before the deadline. And that is the reason why we recommend to have at least like 8 months before the deadline, where you actually start preparing for this registration. If then if the legislative process then suddenly finishes and the deadlines are postponed, then you can just breathe out and relax, because then you don't have to take it further, at least at this point. But at least then you have tried to manage the risks as far as you can at this point in time. So Simon, I hand it over to you. So
yes,
please.
Thank you, Frederick. And I echo and agree with everything that Frederick has said there. But the point here, the bottom point, hope for the best but prepare for the worst. But importantly, that preparation is unlikely to be wasted entirely. I think it's good preparation, because a lot of this you'll need to do anyway. The next slide, please, Frederick. I'm just going to elaborate on why I think that's right. It is still DEFRA policy to have registration, a joint registration in some form as part of its structure. The question will be exactly what data needs to go in for your particular substance. So you still have to find out who's in the substance group. You still have to make that inquiry. Start mapping out what data rights already exist. What have you already got access to, and where are the gaps? And of course, follow these developments on what the substance hazard profile requirements may be. That's still evolving. What the registrant specific risk assessments may be, still evolving. But you can do some work now that will be useful at a later stage. Don't simply sit and do nothing. And on data, you might find there are gaps. Point 4, you might find that you may need to pay to fill those data gaps. Well, by all means, given the changes that are coming, you might not pay for that just yet. But when you make that decision, do think about, is the data actually useful for other business purposes? Would having access to and the right to refer to and copies of that data be useful for your operations in UK reach? Might it be useful for other global regimes? Might you use this moment to negotiate a global data rights over the data, because now is a good time maybe to put that in place as other regimes come on stream? And is it now a good negotiating position if the data owners think that they won't be able to sell this in the future? Might there be some sort of discount? So there could still be good reasons for negotiating and paying for data ownership and access in this particular market. So do think about that as we move forward, and don't simply do nothing. Back to you, Frederick.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusions before we go to the Q&A, and I can still see already that we are getting quite a lot of questions in the chat on top of our pre-submitted questions, which we'll start from in a bit. So just to conclude, so UK REACH entered into force already and is in force already. Transitional registration deadlines apply currently, but there are discussions about extending those. So we're looking at potentially a decision from the EFRA on the extension of these deadlines by December this year, and then of course we're looking forward to hopefully have the legislative process closed by springtime, meaning that by that time we would know and have the legal changes implemented so that we actually can know when the registration deadlines will occur in the future. But I think the most important thing at this point in time is really for you to follow the legislative process closely and really be ready to act fast if there are delays. So the new registration model is something that something that we don't have to at length maybe focus at this point in time, but still it pays to follow the developments closely. So the most important thing is just to understand when the new deadlines are and when the legislative process has been concluded. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I think that is a generic saying that applies to anything, even the UK REACH at this point. And of course, REACH law and STEPTO, we are following these developments closely. So we invite you to feel free to contact us at any time for additional information and just check where the status is. And REACH law will obviously also have additional webinars on the topic as more information becomes available. Okay, so the Q&A part. So let me get my files. So the questions we received ahead of time, and let's see if this time I remember to actually switch on my camera. So I invite Simon to do the same. So first question. So these are the pre-submitted questions. So we'll start with those. We have, I think we have like 12 of those, so bear with us. And of course, if you need to leave, then please do so. You can always watch the recording on YouTube later on. So the first question is, we want to learn more about compliance of polymers derived from nature, for example, modified starches under UK REACH and the regulatory needs. So just to answer this question very quickly, we did not go into this level of technical detail. So I invite you to have a look at REACH law's previous webinars going into more the technical details, but I can already tell you at this point in time that if it is a naturally occurring substance or a naturally occurring polymer that has not been chemically modified, then it is exempt from registration. Of course, I recommend in any case that you consult, for example, REACH law or maybe STEPTO also on this to get a specific answer to your specific case. But generally this applies. I think, Simon, feel free to add any information you feel may be relevant per question. Yep. I'll just go through this quite quickly. These are quite technical in nature. So then we had a question, when do substances have to be registered according to UK REACH? So I think this was covered already in the presentation. And also how does UK REACH differ from the EU REACH regulation? This was also covered in the presentation. I invite you to have a look at slide. Can't remember the number, but it is there. So please, you can pause it in YouTube and have a look. And then there were questions, where can one find the UK equivalent to the EU candidate list, restriction list, and authorization list? So the candidate list is available on the HSC gov.uk/reach/ candidate-list site. So if you just Google, for example, candidate list HSE, I think it will show the result in the first or second listing. So I invite you just use Google in this case, but it is there. Then for the authorizations and the restrictions, so those were carried over with the EU REACH regulation into UK REACH. So they are there in Annex 14 for authorization and Annex 17 in restrictions. So how do you see this, by the way, Simon, going forward? How much will these lists deviate from EU REACH, provided the UK REACH doesn't change dramatically, as is a theoretical possibility, of course? If you have any information to add at this point.
Yes, only to say that they clearly already have diverged and will continue to. So the UK has not followed through with all the restrictions that have come through since 1st of January 2021 in the EU market. And of course, authorizations are designed for those who want to be using substances that are subject to authorization in the market. We did grandfather authorizations, so from here on, so for now, it looks very similar, but of course it will, not only will the candidate list be different and is different, and the authorization annex also, but also different actors, different market participants will either be active or not in the GB market, and there will be differences. So from here on in, both restrictions and authorizations, it is not safe to assume that if it's whatever the status in the EU will automatically be the same in the UK. At the moment, it's very similar because it's only been a couple of years since 2021, but it will continue to diverge. So it's really important to keep looking back at those lists and understanding the different markets.
Thank you, Simon. Very good advice there. And then a quick question: does REACH law and STEPTO offer to take part in a set of CEFs and negotiate the related letter of accesses on behalf of importers? So in the UK, they're called substance groups, but already checked this with Simon. So yes, both REACH law and STEPTO do provide such services. So please be in contact with either of us. We're happy to, of course, help. Then there was a fairly technical question on the new registrations of existing substances, specific to the wording in waivers that are required to be input. So this is goes into a lot of technical things already, but I can just mention that, for example, an example waiver that would need to be added under section 13.2 in the IUCLID dossier could, for example, read as follows: we're currently unable to submit the relevant test data summaries as we have not yet negotiated access for the data for UK REACH purposes. We will make every effort to negotiate with the other members of the substance group, and will subsequently either provide the data as a lead registrant or we become a member of the joint registration, so co-registrants. So that would be, for example, one waiver that you could use, a very simple one, and to the point. I think there's no need to go into much more detail at this point. The next question 7, are the doing and grandfathering still open? Because there is, you can still submit the notification if eligible to do so. You should do this as soon as possible on the HSE website. So do you want to, Simon, take this?
Yes, certainly the position from the Health and Safety Executive is they would rather know that you exist and that you are out there and you are part of the supply chain, even though you are late, than for you to feel reluctant to come forward to the Health and Safety Executive. So they are actively encouraging late do-ins, late downstream user import notifications, because they do realise there's plenty of downstream users in the GB market who this is still very new to a lot of people. So it's encouraged, despite the fact you're beyond the deadline, it's encouraged to come forward and make these notifications. With grandfathering, because you will have held a registration, EU REACH registration, before the UK finally left the single market, I think the health and safety executive will have expected you to have come forward already. But if you do find yourself in that position, it's still very much the health and safety executive are asking people to come forward. If you've somehow missed that, and you'd have to approach them to talk about that. But again, the message from health and safety executive is we want to know you're out there. We want to help you with the transition.
And I really applaud the approach by the agency. They're very, very pragmatic in this. So they really understand that not everyone is on board with all the quick changes. So very happy to see that they're flexible in this. Going to the next question. So there's a saying, the question goes as follows. We are currently evaluating whether we have to register our substances in Great Britain. We will most likely introduce substance into the GB market, so we would like to explore carrying out late pre-registrations if possible. We would then carry out registration. So in this case, as mentioned, so there are no pre-registrations or late pre-registrations under UK REACH. There is the possibility to submit doing notifications and do that late, as Simon already mentioned, but that is subject to your substance being under existing supply. So this is a very much a case dependent on your situation. So I recommend you contact us for additional details. And question 9, do you think we'll get a response to the timeline consultation by the time of the presentation? So I think I already answered this, so no, unfortunately not. So by December, and I think Simon, I think it will go close to the December timeline, meaning before, or what do you expect it to become available earlier than that?
I think they're going to want most of those 12 weeks, not least to show they've thought about it carefully and thought about the responses carefully. So they are thinking about it carefully and thinking about the repercussions, and they'll need ministerial approval for what they finally decide to do and consultation with Scotland and Wales. These things will take time. So I'm not expecting anything until really the end of November, beginning of December.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Simon. So then just a quick one. Will the seminar cover what are the requirements for a doing to be valid? So I would just, in this case, recommend you go into our YouTube channel for REACH Law Talks and have a look at the, we have a webinar there called UK REACH, what's late doing and what's ahead for the chemical industry. I think it's like 10 months ago uploaded. So I invite you to have a look at that, because they will go into much more technical details. We will not in this webinar. Then there was a question to appreciate if we could hear about the latest update on the registration process. In addition, would like to know where one can find potential co-registrants. So again, where we touched upon the new registration model, the information, as said, is very limited, very scarce. Everyone is anxious to know more details, but we don't yet. We'll of course keep you up to date when we know more. But where to find additional co-registrants, you need to inquire in any case. So inquire for your particular substance, and then you will be placed in a substance group where you can see, in this comply with UK REACH IT system, you can see who else has inquired or grandfathered the substance in question, to then take the joint registration process forward, whatever the process will be. And we've also published other webinars on our YouTube channel going to lead registration details and stuff like that. So I invite you to have a look at those at your discretion. Then we have the last question of our pre-submitted question, and as you can see, we're already going way past our timeline. So I hope, Simon, you're available for a while longer. Good. So the question is, how are legal entities defined for only representative purposes under UK REACH? For example, can a European legal entity with several subsidiaries appoint the UK REACH OR and act as an umbrella for all subsidiaries, add volumes of all of them, I assume, like just aggregate all the volumes where required, have one single registration? So I'll leave this to you, Simon. I can provide additional details. So how is a legal entity defined for OR purposes and so forth.
Sure. The principles of legal entities has been copied and pasted across from the EU REACH legislation. So legal entities that have responsibilities in the Great British market will be those who are established in Great Britain. Companies and partnerships and other legal terms like that. An OR, therefore, to take an OR role under UK REACH needs to be established, of course, in the UK, and then and that's for an only representative for somebody who's outside of the EU, sorry, outside of the UK, outside of GB, but in the EU. The question asks about an EU business with subsidiaries. I'm not really sure exactly where these subsidiaries are, but just as with EU REACH, you've got to look at each of the operators and what is their role. Are you a UK manufacturer? Is your subsidiary maybe a related company, but it has its own manufacturing? They're going to need, everybody will need to be assessing what role they are. And of course, you're looking at the GB market for UK REACH. So if you're in Germany or Italy, you're no real difference to being in China or Brazil. You are outside of GB, you are outside of UK REACH. And if you're a legal entity with a manufacturing or a formulator, you're going to need to appoint your only representative to represent you and your supply chain into the GB market. So that's how legal entities work. Frederick, do you want to add?
Yeah, sure.
Color?
Yeah, so generally the other requirement is that on a legal entity basis, if you are a non-GB manufacturer or a non-GB formulator, you can appoint the only representative. So what this means that in this case, if I understand the question correctly, is that you would not be able to just have one only representative covering all your subsidiaries if they are different legal entities and they are manufacturing and formulating mixtures, for example. So you can't do that, essentially. You can do it if you are an importer, because you have then one registration covering your import of that substance from outside of Great Britain, from anywhere, as Simon mentioned. Yes. But it's not possible for only representatives, because only representatives represent the manufacturing or formulating legal entity. That's why you need to first determine what is the status of those subsidiaries. Are they legal entities? Most likely, if they are manufacturing, then if you want to go down the OR route, then those would have to appoint the only representative in the UK. So it's not possible to aggregate the volumes and stuff like that, unfortunately. I hope that answers the question. And that was the last question that we had for the pre-submitted questions. So we're going a bit over time here. I'll try to just take some of the questions that we did not cover in any great detail. There was a question on a legal basis for late doings. Is it applicable for substances not exported to UK in 2019 and 20? Simon, do you want to take this? I think we covered this.
I think we have, but just to make sure we're clear and we can confirm that, a downstream user import notification of doing is only for an existing use and import in the calendar years 2019 and 2020. So whether it was a doing that's been done on time or a late doing, that doesn't matter. It has to relate to a 2019 or 2020 use and import, essentially an existing supply, as Frederick has explained. If you're outside of having that relationship, that existing supply, you're in the NRES process. You're not in the doing process. And the legal basis for late doings, there isn't really a legal basis for late doings. The health and safety executive has simply said, we'd much rather hear from you, even though you're out of time. So please just come and tell us anyway. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Simon. Then there was some questions about Brexit Freedom Bill. I think we covered that also in adequately. Then there was a let's see, UK versus GB reach. So the question, I think this goes, Simon, to you. Northern Ireland is not included in UK reach. What about British overseas territories? I have not thought about, to be honest.
No, I haven't looked at it for any particular clients, but my reaction would be that I mean, the British overseas territories are not in the United Kingdom, and they're definitely not in the market of Great Britain. So they are outside of this regime. Many of the overseas territories adopt UK regimes voluntarily or follow the same rules. That's up for the overseas territories. But what we're talking about here is really England, Scotland, and Wales, the market of Great Britain. So Northern Ireland in EU reach, British overseas territories outside again. So if you're looking at those, do look at the specific territory and that's probably a question in its own right. But it certainly can't be assumed that that would be covered by the rules we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Simon. I've also learned something new. So very good. Then there's one bit more technical question. I'll take this. So the question is there any similar systems as a Euclid or Reach IT as in the EU? So I assume in the UK. So indeed there is a comply with UK Reach IT system, which is Reach IT like. It's not as elaborate, if you will, not as complicated as the EU Reach version, but it gives the possibility to upload dossiers that have been prepared in the iEuclid system. So we use the same system for UK Reach as for EU Reach. So you use iEuclid and upload iEuclid dossiers to the comply with UK Reach IT system. This applies to inquiries, to co-registrations, lead registrations, and NRES registrations. Doing notifications can be done directly in the system, plus uploading an Excel template filled with substance-specific information. So you use iEuclid and upload files into the comply with UK Reach IT system. So let's see. We'll take just a few questions as we're running over time, and let's see. Can the UK Reach OR take the lead registration role? Yes, and that is a good option also if the only representative knows what they're doing, has experience with lead registration cases. Let's see. I think there was also another question on the Brexit Freedom Bill. I will skip some of the more basic questions as I invite you to have a look at the other webinar recordings, and of course feel free to contact Reachlaw or Steptoe on those also. Let's see. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? So generally we do not share these. I invite you to have a look at this recording on YouTube. You can pause the video, take screenshots and so forth. So generally we don't share the presentations. Sorry. Let's see. Do you spot any questions you want to take if you see the chat or Simon? Okay.
Yes, there's lots of them. It's great that you're also involved. But quite a lot of them are quite sort of specific or quite detailed narratives. There's a very easy one I can take. Is article defined under UK Reach in the same way it is under EU Reach? Yes, it is. That's part of our adopting into UK. We've adopted the same definition of article. Whether the courts interpret it in the same way going off into the future is a separate question, but yes, we have the same article definition and we're used to using it, so that will be what you're familiar with.
Thank you, Simon. Two last questions which are fairly simple. So there was a question about the consolidated version of the UK Reach text. One participant couldn't find it, so what we'll do is we'll add the link in the when we send a thank you email for attending this webinar. So we'll include it in that email so you have a direct link. And then the last question. So for those who didn't get an answer after this question, we'll come back to you on a case-by-case basis by email, because your questions were either they were too specific or maybe not maybe so much related to this particular webinar. So the last question, what about indirect imports? Can they be covered by an only only representative registration. So yes, so the same type of mechanism as for EU REACH applies. So absolutely, if the manufacturer, who, for example, who has appointed the OR, allows for indirect import to be covered by the OR, then yes, it is absolutely possible. And I think I know that we have an OR only representative specific webinar recorded in June on our REACH Law Talks website. So I invite you to have a look at that. So on YouTube, in other words. It goes into a lot of details on indirect import, but it also applies to UK REACH as such. Okay, I think that is enough for this webinar. Thank you very much for hanging in there. And Simon, a big thank you for co-hosting this webinar. Always a pleasure to discuss UK REACH and many other things with you. So very happy for you to be here and also provide this information, the valuable information to all the attendees. And of course, the biggest thanks goes out to all the attendees and for those who stuck with us for the whole duration of 1.5 hours more almost of this webinar. So very big thank you to all of you, and please feel free to contact Simon and myself at any time. We'll be, of course, happy to help you with your compliance efforts. So that's it for this webinar. Thank you very much and stay safe.
Thank you.